Chris and Dan show, how's it going? What a budding channel we have. We have a community of people. Mark, we've talked about this book um a few times now on the videos, just mentioned it as we're doing other things. And the title caught people's attention. We had at least two commenters. Shrapnel is one I can think of. He's like, "Oh, I definitely need to check that out." So Shrapnel, I read about three-fourths of it. It's good. It's not what I expected. Okay, so let me introduce Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson, a health and science reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, shared the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. He has been a Pulitzer finalist on three other occasions. His reporting has been anthologized in three editions of the Best American Newspaper Narratives. Before moving to Milwaukee, Johnson was a reporter at the Providence, Rhode Island Journal Bulletin, the Rockford, Illinois Register Star, the Harvard Hill Gazette, and the Provincetown Advocate. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto. So, Mark, I guess let's start first with your career, like health and science. So, you cover this is probably how we're connected on Twitter, but
Mhm.
you cover the pharmaceutical industry, I'm assuming, biotech to some extent, life sciences. And this is your first fiction
Correct.
work, right?
Yes. I should say that I've been a health science reporter for about 10 years now, maybe a little bit more. But I started out being kind of a generalist. Um,
I love
the,
that.
the paper here in Milwaukee sent me, when I first got here, one of my early assignments was I was sent to New York to cover September 11th. Um, I was sent to Houston when the Space Shuttle Columbia blew up. I did a lot of those kind of really grim sort of breaking news stories. But I gradually, I think I wanted to specialize in something, and science kind of caught me by surprise. I actually thought that it was boring until I read this terrific book about a scientist called Genius, the Life and Times of Richard Feynman, and just a fantastic book, and it completely turned my opinion around on scientists. I think I was. It's sort of easy to not like things that you think you're not good at, right?
Mm-hmm.
In school, if you don't do well in math, you say, math's boring. I hate math. That was kind of the way I looked at it with science. I actually, to pass freshman biology, I had to come after school and dissect a dog shark because I was doing so badly.
Mm.
So,
I mean, I was molecular and cellular bio major at the University of Arizona, and I also I didn't really do well in my subject. I was pre-med, but now I find myself like as a functioning adult getting much more interested. And obviously I work in the space. Chris works in the space. And in a way I regret not paying more attention, but I also don't regret anything because we have books to read and we can always learn. Learning it does not end at university. That's just meant to pique your curiosity, not necessarily the end all of your education.
now I think university kind of, at least for me, it taught me how to be discerning about the things I really wanted to read. It sort of taught me that uh, reading should be a pleasure. And one of the things that's really difficult, I think, about education, all the way, grade school, all the way up through high school, is that you're always being you're reading stuff that you're forced to read, right? Some teacher has a list of books, and you might like them or you might not. And if it's a 600-page book and you really don't like it, that's a slog. And you can never. I mean, when you're going through something like that, you sometimes you find it hard to imagine that reading can be fun and pleasurable.
What are your thoughts on and we're gonna have the link to Though the Earth Gives Way underneath this video, so you guys go get it. What do you think about the new form of reading, like audiobooks, Audible? Um, I mean, I found myself consuming content like through Audible much more than reading, although in the past I used to read a lot more. Now I listen more, but I don't know. To me, it's like a little, it's not the same because I find myself spacing out a lot. What are your thoughts on that? Like as an
Well, it's
author?
really interesting you bring that up because for, I'd say, the first 10 years or so that I was a reporter, most of what I read was nonfiction. And I was a real news reporting nerd. I kind of almost exclusively read books by other reporters, right? So almost no fiction. Then in 1994, my wife and I moved from Rockford, Illinois to Providence, Rhode Island. It's over 1,000 miles the trip, and we each had to drive a separate car. And each one of us had a separate cat. We each had one of our cats. And so we got 1,000 miles and basically nobody but a cat to talk to. So I bought audiobooks. I bought three. The ones that I can remember was I got Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses and Toni Morrison's Jazz. And she reads her own novel, and they were spellbinding. I'd forgotten how much fun it is to have somebody else tell you a story.
Tell you the story.
And the
Yeah.
thing is that those were, in a way, it was great because all those hours driving, I mean, they were kind of empty hours. And this way I felt like I was kind of feeding my brain a little bit. And I was reading some books that I probably wouldn't have otherwise read. And I really got into both Toni Morrison and Cormac McCarthy afterwards. I think I've read almost everything that Cormac McCarthy has written.
Hmm. What are your thoughts on, because one of the things we have now, I mean, somebody can be watching right now and say, whoa, that's awesome that we have the option now to not just read, but to listen to a book. And it sounds cool until you realize that you're not in a vacuum and you have a lot of things competing for your attention, namely podcasts. Um, what do you think as an author, someone who's made a career out of writing, do you think podcasts are a threat to people's consumption of books?
Oh no, I don't think so. I think anywhere that people get to talk about language is a good thing. I think that it has podcasts have actually created much better dialogue, not just about books, but about many different things. I think too that they are kind of a civilizing influence. I With a lot of my stories, I used to read the comments that readers would write in. Our papers actually had to stop allowing readers to comment because they were so terrible. Um, the idea that this was sort of a kind of open to exchange of ideas was just completely by the board. People just teed off on each other, called each other names. I honestly felt like that form of dialogue was leading more and more to people absolutely hating each other and not listening to each other. I think that podcasts kind of remind you more that talking about ideas can be done in a civil way. We don't have to be, threatening to fight each other just because we have different opinions.
Yeah,
Sounds
sounds like Twitter.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
going to say your comment board sounds like Twitter. That's exactly what I was going to
Yeah.
say.
Oh, it
That's
is
another
terrible.
thing. Twitter's
You know,
another thing that's competing with people's attention, right?
Yeah, that's true. Um, initially, I got to say, I wasn't a big fan of Twitter at the beginning. I'm not sure that I'm a big fan of it now, but what happened was like about 12 years ago or so, the newspaper forced all the reporters to have Twitter accounts, so that basically so we could promote our stories, right?
Right.
Say have like a short little headline and then a link to it, et cetera, et cetera. And the first few times, I think for the first 2 years, I did not post a single thing. And when people who knew me, said, when I get a notification that they were following me, I would send them a stock note that said, hey, I really appreciate your following me, but I got to be honest with you. The only thing more boring than being me is following me. Eventually I kind of changed my mind, because I saw that, especially covering health and science, it's not like covering sports where there's a huge audience out there. I think you have to work a lot harder to get your audience and keep it.
Get the attention. Yeah. I
Yeah.
know Chris and I, we're not authors, but we did write one book together about
Well, then
clinical
you're
research.
authors.
Well, okay, we're authors. It's not our career, but it's a part of our career now.
Mhm.
But yes, it's hard to get like science readers or people interested in just niche topics. It's hard to keep their attention because you're also competing against other things they like, sports, politics, entertainment. So whenever they have more time, your content really has to resonate with them in order for them to even check you out, even if they're interested in clinical research. It's one of the interesting things we have, and all these things competing for our attention. I'm just fascinated by this. One of the things I wanted to get your opinion on as well, and then we're going to get into the book. One thing I've noticed, I've always, like, compared to my peers, I don't know if it's saying much, but compared to my peers and maybe classmates or whatever from school, even now, like colleagues, I think I read more than many. So that's good. It's not necessarily a contest for me, but I try to make a habit to read books, like actual books, not post on Facebook so much or Twitter, as engaging as that may be, and it hits all the dopamine receptors. They figured that out. One thing I've noticed, and even for myself, so I can't imagine like for people who don't actually read like real stuff, my writing, because you're like, when you're on Twitter or Facebook and you're reading poor grammar, your writing suffers as a result. I've caught myself. I used to never get like your and your confused, but now that I'm consuming more social media, I am. Like, I'm
That
making
makes a
these
lot
mistakes.
of sense, I think.
I think it's a real problem. Someone needs to write a book on this.
Yeah, that's a really good subject. I think part of it was that a lot of us, I grew up before the internet. It seems now, when I tell my son that there was a time before the internet, it just like blows his mind. It's like, I might as well be talking about I saw dinosaurs, because it doesn't seem like how did you ever manage? But it was, I think, a lot more, in some ways, conducive to reading. You were limited in your choices. I think television wasn't as good on the whole as, it's been kind of a golden age for television the last maybe 10, 20 years. And I think if you wanted to really, kind of rest, relax, but also nourish your brain a little, I think, there wasn't too much else besides books and maybe magazines and newspapers. I got to say, I'm a big fan of both magazines and newspapers. I got to have something to read at night.
Those are two things I have to admit I haven't read in like maybe a decade. Occasionally I'll read a newspaper if it like lands on my doorstep, but I won't like go out of
Well,
my way to get one.
don't you occasionally read like online content, newspaper? I mean, it's
Most
not a
newspapers
physical
are like
paper, but
most of them are behind paywalls now. Like the other day, I actually clicked on
Mhm.
something on Twitter and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I actually want to read it. And it's like, oh, subscribe to get more. I'm like, I'm not that interested.
That's true. I run into that a lot. I get people now when I've written something. Usually, it tends to be when I've written a sort of longer story, and I'll get people write in and say, oh, I'd really like to read this, but it's behind this paywall, and it's a bit of a trade-off because the reality is that the paywall it's not a lot of pay for us. If you pay $1, you get 6 months complete access online. You're just about never going to get a better deal than that. I mean, honest to God, the amount of time I spend reading newspapers anyway, I spend a ton more reading the New York Times, and I still feel it's worthwhile. But it is hard because we're so used to everything online being free,
Mhm.
and once I think that newspapers made almost a fatal mistake in initially putting all their content up for free, because once you've given somebody something for free, it's really hard to come back to them and say, hey, can
Yeah.
you pony up some money?
But
Mhm.
what's the stop like? Because this is something we can focus on a little bit because it's the business of journalism.
Mhm.
It used to be a lot simpler, right? I was never a journalist, but I could imagine it used to be a lot simpler. You paid to write, and now it's like, well, you got to be a personality, like all the ESPN guys, right? They used to be paid to write, they used to be paid to break news. Now they're paid to be entertainers. Like someone like Stephen A. Smith, he's bigger, arguably, than ESPN.
That's probably true. I think it's not the same though at a place like Sports Illustrated. I mean,
Mm.
a lot of their best writers, to be honest, I have no idea whether they're on television that much. I mean, I loved Gary Smith's writing for Sports Illustrated. I think he's probably one of the best magazine reporters ever. I mean, for any magazine. And I mean, I have probably about 20 or 30 of his um, articles in my desk drawers, and I'll reread them for pleasure because they were so incredibly well written. And I think that I mean, Sports Illustrated is probably a little bit different in that way. And I mean, it got a readership before there was ever an ESPN.
Mm.
So people were used to it being kind of an upmarket, sort of thing. If you liked, if you were kind of the type of person that liked stories the length of like a New Yorker kind of thing, but you were really into sports and not the kind of stuff that the New Yorker writes about, then Sports Illustrated was, you were going to get the best game write-ups, the best, profiles, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, we can talk about this for hours, but we're let's switch gears. Chris and I, we finally collaborated in 2019 and wrote the book, The Comprehensive Guide to Clinical Research. That was not our first attempt at co-authoring a book, or I don't even know if Chris remembers this.
Oh no.
Chris, we collaborated like in 2015 and we failed miserably. We didn't get past like the first chapter. We wanted to write a fictional book on, I think it was like hell or like someone's moral dilemmas. Like these two stories were gonna
Yes,
meet.
pretty
Interesting.
much something similar to Dante's Inferno, but with significant differences.
Like modern, right? Modern.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was tough, man. I found writing the nonfiction so much easier. So much easier. Maybe not as fun to write, but
Mhm.
way easier than a fiction. What are your experiences as someone who's done
Actually,
both?
I think it was kind of very similar for me. Um, it's embarrassing to admit this, but I have on my computer a large collection of half finished, quarter finished short stories, horrendous poetry, stuff I'd be embarrassed to show anybody, but that for some reason I wrote because I just wanted to, or I wanted to try. I think that it was interesting, your choice of words. When you said, we failed, I wouldn't think of it that way, because I've really, and this is something I think that science has helped me with. In science, failure is actually a good thing. It's the way great discoveries are made. No, very few people just, like look up in the sky and, bing, a light goes on and they have a cure for cancer or whatever. It's almost always, it's, years, sometimes decades of things that don't work. And then, eventually you learn from each of those attempts. And I think it's very similar with writing.
So lots of trial and error.
Exactly. And I think you have to be at the right place to actually see something through to completion. I mean, for me, I was going through a rough patch in my reporting career when I wrote the novel. I worked for an entire year on an investigative piece that never got published. It went all, we were facing a lot of threats of lawsuits and stuff like that. And eventually it got spiked. And I did probably a dozen rewrites of it. And during the course of that, I got to feeling like I was starting to dislike writing. And I mean, that's like my whole, it's been my life up to this point. And yet writing this same story over and over again, 12 different ways, rearranging it, and still, having it go back and forth between lawyers and editors. It was, in some ways, it was kind of soul crushing. And so instead, I reached this one point where I'd had this idea for a long time. In high school, I had this great European literature teacher who had us read Boccaccio's Decameron, which is considered one of the earliest novels. It was even, it was written before Canterbury Tales, but it's a very similar sort of story. It's about a group of noblemen and noblewomen who flee from Florence during the Great Plague. And to pass the time, they hole up in this villa outside of Florence, and they tell each other stories. And I'd had this idea that what if
sounds somewhat similar.
That's exactly where the idea came from.
I got it.
Yeah, that what if instead of the event that's causing people to flee, instead of it being the plague, what if it's climate change, which is something we really are concerned about, and which does have the potential to, cause massive worldwide disruption. And so that's where the idea came from. And normally in my career, I would have thought about it for a couple of days and I would have said, that's kind of a cool idea. And then I would have said, I got other stuff to do. I'd rather watch some TV instead of, typing. But I was so frustrated in some of my reporting that I decided to give this a shot. And I started writing in bed at night before I go to sleep. I'd write about 45 minutes and then I'd read 45 minutes. And it was sort of like a deal with myself. If I put in 45 solid minutes of writing the book, then I could read something I really wanted to read. And
it doesn't have to be related, right?
Didn't have to be related at all. And it's probably going to make me sound like a nerd, but I got to enjoying the writing so much that I'd be at work at my newsroom, and the book was kind of like, having the greatest banana cream cheesecake sitting in your refrigerator at home. I just couldn't wait to get to it. It was like, I'll do my stories and stuff like that here, in the newsroom, but I can't wait to get home and lay in bed and see where this thing goes.
Write your book. You're talking about that
Right.
process.
Yeah. And it wasn't a case where, I had a very loose plot. I knew I wanted it to involve a group of strangers who meet and end up telling each other stories. But within that context, as I was writing it, from one day to the next, I didn't exactly know where it was going to go. And I didn't know what the ending was going to be until
Really?
Very close to the end.
Do you think that makes for better books, or do you think it could go both ways?
I don't know. I kind of felt guilty because a lot of good writers I've read interviews with, they talk about knowing the ending right at the start, which seems like a really good idea. You know the point that you're trying to get. It's like getting in your car and driving, and it sure helps if you know you're going to New York rather than just somewhere on the East Coast,
So I would,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to add, I would tend to agree with that. I remember watching a movie, I think about 2000. At the time, it was one of my favorite genres, like thriller. And I was really enjoying the movie. And then when it got to the end, all I could think was, this is such a horrible ending. They must have just kind of free rolled it and then didn't know how to end it. So they just ended it this way that made no sense. So I tend to agree with it would make sense, at least in my mind, to have an idea of what your ending looks like.
I totally agree with you. And I think too that you bring up a really good point, which is that a bad or unsatisfying ending can just destroy an otherwise good,
Absolutely.
reading experience. So you're going through this book, you're loving it, and then all of a sudden, after it being, very original, the writer chooses some cliched, ending. It's like a movie that, has a really clever sort of thriller plot, but ends with a predictable, car chase and shootout.
Exactly.
I had that same experience with the TV show Lost. Like, it was great, and then the end, I'm like, what the hell is this? That might have been other influences on those writers, but yeah, no, that's crazy. Because, and in writing fiction, which is very different, at least from my experiences with writing technical stuff, like with the technical stuff, there is no real end. You just have an idea of like what you want to put in the book, and you try to find a way to make it all fit in a way that flows better. In fiction, you got like all these side chains, and you don't really think everything through until you're writing it, and then you're like, wait a minute, what happens here? Because I didn't think about this. So now you go off on a tangent, but you still got to bring it back. I think it's like way more difficult to do fiction.
The thing is that in there's a lot of good nonfiction that actually the ending is just as important as it is in fiction. If you think about good histories or good biographies that you've read, I used to be a real fan of true crime stuff. I was kind of addicted to it for a number of years, and it's the same thing with a true crime book. If on page 2 who did it and why, and it doesn't seem like they're a really interesting person, and you got 400 pages to go, is it worth the body count?
Right. Who's going to read the 398 pages?
Yeah, but on the other hand, a really skillfully written true crime story can tell you about a crime that you remember. You know how it's going to end, and yet there's details in there that keep you going. You think, boy, I didn't know that when that was happening. I just watched a TV miniseries called Candy. It was about a murder case in Texas, and I don't remember the case actually at all, but my wife sort of, we tend to watch quite a few of these kind of things. She skipped ahead and sort of looked up on Wikipedia like what this case was, and she knew where it was going to go and everything.
My wife hates when I do that.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I didn't want her, don't tell me where it's going. But it didn't seem to bother her. She was, riveted just the same, even though she knew how it was going to end up. And I think that's the real skill in writing, in both writing and filmmaking. That a really well put together piece keeps people going.
Yes. And you have to consider your audience as well, because they're not all the same. So it happens less to me in books, but in movies, like my wife and I will be watching the same movie, but the movie will lose me at a certain point and it won't lose her, or vice versa, because of some other plot that's happening. And so my mind takes off. And now I'm not paying attention to the movie because I'm thinking about like what I would do in this situation. It's kind of weird. Like no two people consume the same piece of content the same. That's the craziest part about all this.
Yeah, it's funny. My son Evan, he's 24, and he's really into movies, and so we both like to watch them together. But for the most part, we have very similar tastes, but there's some things we really split on. And recently, maybe it was like 3 or 4 months ago, we were watching a Wes Anderson movie. I think it was the French Dispatch. And, not meaning to sort of beat up on Wes Anderson, but if you've watched his movies, there's sort of this really dry sense of humor. And you either like it or you don't. And Evan and my wife both loved it. And I'm sitting there, I know the lines that are supposed to be like kind of funny, but they're not like funny, ha ha. They're like funny, oh yeah, like they make you smile a little bit. And we were like, I'd say 45 minutes into it, and my son looks at me and he says, "Are you liking the movie, Dad?" And I want to say, because he sometimes gets upset, I want to say like I'm really enjoying it. I had to say, I get that you two are really enjoying this, but I'll stay in the room if it makes it better for you, but I'm really not into it.
Yeah. And then what's even crazier is you changed later, possibly. So, 10 years from now, you may actually like that. And you might think, why the hell did I not like this back then? It's so complex.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think it's the same with books too. I mean, I think there's books that we read when we're too young. Like a good example for me is Charles Dickens. So many English teachers force 6th, 7th, 8th graders to read Charles Dickens. And it is just so not the world of a kid that age. There are long sentences. A lot of the strength of Dickens's writing is character development. He has great characters, but it does take a long while for things to build. And, when you're in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, in general, you're kind of not that patient. You want things to happen. I mean, it's like the way you feel about your life. You want your life to get going, Yeah. And that's why, people kids in 8th grade can't wait to be in college,
It's so like, that reminds me of, so in your book, you actually reference one of the books that this story reminded me of, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It was recommended to me by Tim Ferriss, who I follow. And, I was in my early 20s when I read this, and, I didn't get it. I felt like I didn't get it. I was trying to read it. I felt like I was reading it wrong because I was trying to get something out of it rather than just enjoying the story and thinking of the philosophy. But as an older person, I actually enjoyed it a lot. So it has a lot to do with your mindset. What about
I've
books
got
like,
just on Zen, I got to tell you this.
yeah,
I read it because,
you love that book, I can tell.
I absolutely adore it. So my first year out of college, I couldn't afford to buy a car. And so I ended up buying a motorcycle, which for being a reporter in New England
Oh,
wasn't
my.
the best idea. I hadn't really
Awful.
considered the concept of winter, like driving through snow and stuff like that. But I started reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance when I had my bike. And I'm not at all mechanically inclined, but I just loved the book. I loved the fact that it was very thoughtful. I really liked the way it handled sort of mental health issues, and the relationship between the boy and the father was something that I really kind of seized upon. And the last 20 pages of that book are so powerful. Every few years, I go back and read like the last 2 chapters over, because they move me almost to tears. They're so powerful.
Chris, that's one I recommend to you. But then again, recommendations don't always work for other people. One of we can nerd out on writing more, because I have a book in my mind that I'm trying to get out at some point. But someone like Tom Clancy, rest in peace, Tom Clancy, he would write fiction, but it was so compelling because it's so realistic. You can tell the dude like researched the hell out of whatever he's writing about. And like he was actually a fan of war and strategy. So you can't really fake that. Others, like let's say Ayn Rand, right? She's got a loyal following of libertarians primarily. I thought the ideas are great in her book, but the book's written like terribly. It's so boring, so hard to get through. But both styles could be equally impactful to the same person. Like I just think that's insane how that works. Have you noticed your style switching as a writer, or do you tend to keep the same kind of style?
Oh, I think I changed pretty drastically. When I first got out of college, I had this idea that I wanted to be a political reporter. I nerded out reading. In college, I would go to the library and look up the original Watergate stories, Woodward and Bernstein. And I thought, that's going to be me someday. And so my first job, I end up on Provincetown, this very tiny town on the tip of the Cape. And the very first thing that I do as a reporter, and this is so far away from like meeting unnamed sources in a parking garage. I went to a sewer commission meeting, and all meeting long for like an hour and a half, they're talking about blah, 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 sewer this and septage that, and sewer this and septage that. And I realized, I don't know what septage is. And so my very first question as a so-called professional reporter, I go up to one of the council members and I say, I got to ask you, what is the difference between sewage and septage? And swear to God, he says, one's chocolate milk, the other's chocolate pudding. That was like so far away from like, Nixon and Watergate and, uncovering crime. It was just such a come down. And I think I discovered very early on, I covered the 1988 presidential election. And I just discovered I got to like politics less and less almost by the minute. There were times when I just hated seeing the calculation of it, the way that something that was supposed to be inspiring would actually be kind of, waffly and obsequious. And I hated all this sort of false handshake kind of, phoniness that went along with it. It was I was really surprised, because I thought that was, I'm going to be that kind of reporter. And I got much more into kind of storytelling. I found that talking to people who were not super famous, like, not Michael Dukakis or whatever, could be much, much more interesting. I did an interview when I was in Providence with a guy who was the last living person to have sailed on a whaling ship out of New Bedford. He was like way more interesting than Michael Dukakis. I mean, he was a really old guy, like with this, sort of leathery skin. And I think he may have been 102 or something like that. And he just, he knew how to tell a story. And I just sat there, rapt. You feel like it was such a privilege to talk with him. Well, he was so interesting. And I think that was a bit of that was a revelation to me, that a lot of people that are not going to be in newspapers all the time or be in the history books can live absolutely fascinating lives and, be much better subjects than, the people that, get written about all the time.
So what I take from that is normal people tend to be more interesting than artificial, superficial politicians.
I think that's a pretty good message to take from it. I think also that, it's funny the number of so-called ordinary people, right, who I'll call them up and say, I want to come interview you about such and such. And they'll say, gee, why do you want to talk to me? I'm really, I'm just ordinary. There's nothing interesting about my life. But you'd be amazed at the things that, are interesting about people's lives. There was a story I read a while back about there's some other brain condition that some people have where they can remember every moment from their lives, every moment. It's like they have a photographic memory, but for their entire lives. Whereas if we try to think back, like for, a particular day 5 years ago, or even stuff that happened like on important days, like our wedding days and stuff like that, there's things you forget. Well, it's really interesting to sort of sit there and ask yourself, what are the good things about being able to remember everything, and what are the bad things? I mean, in some ways, it's not, there's a lot of stuff I'm glad I don't remember in too much detail. Getting beaten up by a guy on the hockey team in high school wasn't a real fun day. I'm glad that my memory's a little bit hazy on that, because I wouldn't want to go back to that particular half hour of my life.
I think that's why stories, they're technology. I mean, it's one of the oldest technologies known to man. It's an easy way to share information amongst generations.
I'll give you another example of an interesting person. I didn't write this story, but someone else when I was in Providence did. He was doing a story about one of those roads that used to be like the main highway until the main highway came along. And then it's like all lined with like kind of cheap motels and, stores that are now decimated. They're like virtually out of business. And he went in and talked to a guy who was running a motor inn, motel. He's got a like virtually empty parking lot, absolutely quiet, practically tumbleweeds rolling over. And during the course of talking with this guy, he found out that the guy was writing a book, his own book on loneliness. I thought, that's a good story. A guy who's, had this thriving business and all of a sudden is just all these hours by himself, writing a book on loneliness. To me, that's something that's kind of cool. And I'm interested. I want to find out about that,
Do you, as far as this book, this was your first fiction?
Correct.
Do you have another one in you? Like, do you have these things that compel you to want to write?
Yeah, I'm about 160 pages into my second novel. It's tentatively called Pete the Arsonist, and it's very different from this one. It's actually based loosely on a place that I worked, a little town I used to cover when I was in Rhode Island, and some of the characters that were in this town. But it's very different. I at this point I don't really know whether it's how it's going to hit people. It's much more of a attempt to the voice of the narrator, I think, is much more important. I'm trying to write in a style that's, sorry, that's a little sort of like in between Holden Caulfield, from Catcher in the Rye, and Frank Bascom from The Sports Writer, who's sort of this great kind of middle-aged guy. And it's sort of that, like this one person whose perspective is kind of like kind of calling out phoniness and BS and stuff like that. So that's a large part of what the book is. But it's also, he's got, this particular character has some secrets and has his identity in this particular town is that he's known as Pete the Arsonist, because when he was in high school, he did some stuff. And it's followed him around, the rest of his life.
It seems like I guess a fictional book. I mean, they're all going to have lessons in it, but back to Though the Earth Gives Way, this one was written, I'm assuming, for very different purposes, right?
Yeah.
What were like some of the main objectives? Like the one main one, according to you, and then the sub objectives.
Well, the main one was that, so I've been working as a science reporter for a long time, but I haven't really written a lot about climate change. And about 5 or 10 years ago, it had really struck me that, I'm writing all these stories about, small, like little scientific advances and stuff. And I'm still, doing a lot of stuff, like from time to time, I'll cover a shootout or something like that. And all these things pale in comparison to this huge story that's sort of hanging over us, which is climate change. I mean, it's the equivalent of what the threat of nuclear weapons was when I was growing up. I mean, it was such an ever-present fear that I used to have nuclear war nightmares, right? So part of the reason for writing that was I wanted to call attention, to the problem of climate change. But I also wanted to, one of the things that fascinated me was the way that people are polarized now. We're polarized about stuff that's really, relatively speaking, little, sometimes. We're polarized about, this small, arcane part of healthcare, or, this particular, bill that's coming up for a vote. Well, think what would happen if climate change does go to its conceivable end, and we've screwed up the planet. We've doomed ourselves and our children. Then you're going to have this group of people who is, beyond like I told you so. It's like we were shaking you, trying to make you understand this. And then a group of people who'd all thought it was, fake news or BS or, whatever. And so the idea was that I thought if people, can come to, to blows over small issues, what on earth is it going to do to humanity if the issue is that half of us, or some large portion of us, basically participated in the destruction of our planet. You know, the other thing I wanted to kind of get across though too is that even among the people, and I will put myself in this group, the people who believe in climate science, read some of the stuff and, you know that it's not BS. Even knowing that, there's a lot of things I could have done and haven't done. I mean, because it's easy to have a political point of view, right? It's much harder to convert that point of view into changes in your life. I mean, I've for most of my marriage, my wife and I drove around beater cars. I mean, at one point I had it's like a 16-year-old Saab with the muffler was tied on with a bootlace, and she had this really, and that was like our best car. We had a Volvo that was like 10 years older than that, and now I'm starting to try to make like little steps. I mean, we bought our first new car in like 35 years, and we bought a hybrid, which it's not exactly being like, zero carbon footprint, but it's like trying to take a step. It's sort of, I think one of the things that I realized in the course of writing the book was that a lot of people, myself included, have sort of talked a good game. And it's really hard to come face to face with some of the choices that we may need to make. I mean, I was just reading a press release today. There's a fairly convincing argument that eating meat actually is bad for greenhouse gases. First of all, cow flatulence, believe it or not, is a major source of greenhouse gases. But there's a lot of stuff also about farming animals that involves fossil fuels. And yet I like a good hamburger. I don't, I mean, I really, my son's a adamant vegetarian. I mean, he's always like telling me like, how can you live with yourself? And like, well, it tastes good, We
know a few people like that, Chris and I. We like ribeye too much.
Oh.
The problem I have with that, I have no problem with people like you who do their part.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem a lot of people have
mm-hmm.
is the hypocrisy from some of the elites. I mean, let's just take, for example, flying. Everyone flies their own private jet to like some climate change convention in Geneva. Like, that makes zero sense, right? To us regular people watching. Like, if you believe in this so much, why do you do that? Why don't you change your behavior? It was kind of the same thing with like the feedback Gavin Newsom was getting in California when he made everybody go on lockdown, and then him and his staff, this doesn't apply to us. We're chilling here maskless and eating inside. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy, and I think that's causing more of the division. It'd be different if everybody got behind it, right?
True.
And I think that's the problem, that I don't know how that's going to resolve, because it doesn't look like a lot of these people who make the rules follow the rules.
Right. But on a different level, though, if you look at it, right? I mean, that to make important international decisions, the kind of policies that will actually potentially save our planet, we have to have our leaders meet, and they have to meet somewhere. Mm-hmm. They're not gonna, you and I know that they're not gonna walk there.
They gotta get on Southwest, like the rest of us, man.
And they're not gonna bike there. So you're absolutely right. It's hypocritical, but it's kind of at the point of being a necessary evil. We have to do one to help us achieve the other. The problem is that we're going to these meetings and spending tons, of, using up all this jet fuel, And we're coming out with these like itty bitty policy changes that really don't move,
Yeah.
the bar that much. And then worse than that, I read this Washington Post investigation about 6 months ago, and basically most of the countries are misleading the United Nations when it comes to their greenhouse gas emissions. Each country is sort of trusted to submit its numbers, and they're all basically lying, and
Except the United States, they're lying too.
oh, we're lying too.
Everybody's lying.
I don't know how much we're lying.
Some lie more than others.
Well, it's sort of like taxes, right? There's loopholes in there. And one of the loopholes is that you get to make an allowance. You get to subtract greenhouse gases based on how many trees you have, because trees sort of suck up carbon, right?
Chris, how many trees you got in your yard?
Right. Well, and the thing was that I think the story I read, it began with like, I think it took place in Malaysia, and it said that the Malaysians had basically said their trees could suck up like 3 times more carbon than like any other normal tree would.
That's crazy.
And it's like, it's one of those
probably.
cases.
Oh, sorry, cut you off. What were you gonna say?
I was just going to say, it's one of those cases where a lot of times when we exaggerate or lie, it's not helping us, to do so. I mean, in this case, making ourselves feel better, if we're not giving an accurate picture of where things are, isn't really going to save us.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and then we can move on as we wrap up to music. Chris, we might do something here with with this interview, but as far as music's concerned, we'll get into that. But what I was gonna say, look, I think people, like, their bullshit detectors are always high, right? Like, I've been one. I've never voted for any party other than independent for president in my life. Okay, I just think we need a third party, but I cannot, and I probably sit in the camp, I'll be honest with you. I sit in the camp on this climate change debate where I'm just looking at the elitists. I'm going to follow their lead. Like, that's the camp I'm in, right? Like, I don't trust these politicians. Anything they say at this point, I take with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to mainstream media. But with all that being said, okay, there's no denying we live in Southern California. Chris and I just moved to Arizona, but during lockdown, all right, March 2020, April 2020, SoCal is like terrible with pollution. But during those months, I remember, like, I was outside. One of my neighbors, this Korean dude, Trump supporter, he has no business saying climate, the climate's affected. We look at the sky because we got nothing else to do, and we're like, man, it's freaking beautiful. Like, we haven't seen the sky like this, and this is 2020. This is like not 1980s Southern California. Like, this is after emissions controls and all that stuff. And then it went away when lockdowns ended. So, like, to me, that's common sense. Like, bullshit detector, I just look at the sky. I don't need to listen to a politician in that case. So, to be honest with you, I'm not sure where I stand on this, but my eyes didn't deceive me during March through May.
Okay, let me put one thought in your mind.
Okay.
I think that most people, I've never lived in California, but my son went to college at the Cal Arts Institute. So we used to visit him. I know California gets very hot at certain times, and he was around Los Angeles, and I know that Los Angeles has pollution problems, right? Well, I think it was last summer, Portland had a major heat wave. It was so bad that they measured the temperature in some of the poorest neighborhoods, and it got to 117 degrees. They actually had people falling and dying on streets. That is not made up stuff.
Yeah.
personally, I didn't see that, but from the accounts that I've read, it happened. And I think anybody, again, using common sense, knows that something's wrong with that. You know, I mean, I never remember growing up it being hot enough for people to actually pass out and die, you know, being outside. And I think, and that happens regularly now for people who live in Phoenix. I mean,
Phoenix is getting bad. I live in Arizona now, not in Phoenix, but yeah, Phoenix is like LA used to be because it's in a valley, so everything just stays.
yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of used to the idea that 100, 200, 300 people will die during, you know, their sort of hottest summer months.
Man, I don't know how we come to a resolution with people, but I guess we do need to have these kind of discussions more often. Chris, you were
So-
going to say something, right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that you're using a bad comparison there. The 1980s were much worse climate-wise,
Yeah.
not
Yeah, yeah.
climate-wise, but pollution-wise in Southern California.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Like in the 80s, you know, it was like smog. I remember being here in the 80s too. It was like you couldn't even see
Okay.
like the signs on the freeway, and now you can't. I think emissions control has something to do with that, but my eyes didn't deceive me during that lockdown, man. Like, and who knows? Like, this is my whole thing, Mark, is like, you know, you get like equally intelligent people as yourself from the other side saying, well, this is solar flares. There's nothing we can do. It's a way for the elitists to control our economic output so that we can, you know, lower the standard of living in US so that China or someone else, some, you know, conspiracy theory, which who knows whether it's true. I mean, I don't know anybody in the elites. I don't know George Soros personally. I have no idea. So on some level, like, is what you're saying that we don't know and it's just better to err on the side of caution?
Well, I would agree with that statement to some degree, but I think I would I'd challenge the idea that we don't know. I mean, I think one of the most compelling arguments, and when I get people emailing me and telling me that it's all a hoax and it's, you know, bullshit, I connect them to this story. It was a series of stories that a publication called Inside Climate News did. And they were about how Exxon's own scientists discovered in the early 70s that climate change was real, that it was human caused, and that it was going to wreak havoc with the planet. And basically, the whole series takes you through this discovery that, and these are scientists who work for Exxon. I mean, they're the last people who, you know, should be concluding that that, you know, fossil fuels are killing us. And this is what they concluded. And Exxon had a choice what way to go on that. And instead, what they started doing was funding efforts to combat that. You know, other publications, alternative research, you know, anything that would basically put doubt in people's minds. And in some ways, if we lose this, doubt is going to be what killed us. I mean, it's in some ways, it's almost worse than, you know, denialism, really.
Yeah, that's kind of when Chris and I had this debates back and forth back in the day when we used to share an office. I told him, you know what? I don't know, but this is not something you want to play with. I like to figure out later.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be, one of the things that I've sort of thought about is with my son, you know, I'm 58 now, and I don't want to, you know, be on my deathbed and all the terrible things that we thought were going to happen are happening. And he's like, you know, in his 40s or whatever, and he's got to deal with it for 20 or 30 years. He's got to deal with privations, just a world that is much, much worse than the one that I got to live in. I mean, every generation is sort of, our goal is to make things better for our kids, right? I think it's one of the few things that conservatives and liberals could agree on, that we want our kids to have it better than we did.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, if we're screwed and half the world is so hot it's uninhabitable or flooded like under the ocean, it's going to be hard to tell our kids, it's better.
So what's the solution then? Because up and coming economies, they rely on fossil fuels, absolutely rely on them. That's how they get ahead, right? Electric vehicles are not the solution.
They're
we
not
don't
the
have
solution now, but
they're dirtier to create than fossil fuels, than vehicles that emit fossil fuels, or use fossil fuels and emit carbon. And not only that, but if everybody were to switch over to electric vehicles today, there would be no electricity to run your house, right? So they're not the solution, at least, like you said, not today.
We need solar. This is my idea. We need solar in every house.
So if you want your children to have a better life, what's the solution, right? Because I would think at this point, with as many people that there are on the planet, we'd all be moving back to caves, right?
Well, I think so. Here's what I'd say in regard to that. There's certainly, it's obviously not going to be an easy thing to solve, but I think that it's not an option to just say, well, this is hard, this way isn't going to work, and this way isn't going to work, and this way isn't going to work. I think if a meteor were headed towards our planet, and we knew it was going to hit in 90 days, wouldn't that be our priority? I mean, it wouldn't be like the November election. All of a sudden, that would be like meaningless.
Sure.
This
Absolutely.
meteor heading towards us would be the priority. And I sort of feel like, there are very smart people in sciences and in all kinds of walks of life. And I think if we made this the priority, if we realized that, maybe not our lives, but our children or their children's lives depend on it, I think we'd find a solution. I mean, one of the things that gives me a great deal of hope was the vaccines for COVID. Now, I know there are some people who are skeptical about vaccines. I've read a lot of the science on them, and
we're having this guy on the show at some point, Dr. McCullough. I mean, it's fascinating. Like, I like to hear both sides, but I just picked this one up. He's going to come on the show. But yeah, go ahead.
Early in the pandemic, in March of 2020, I talked to scientists all over the US, and people were talking about, like, the government was saying, we hope to have a vaccine by the end of the year. Not one scientist I talked to said it was possible. Not one. The most optimistic I heard was somebody who thought that possibly in 18 months. And yet they were able to have vaccines that are more effective than any of the ones that we've had, up to now. I mean, 90 or 95% effectiveness is an incredible win. And they were done not in 10 years like most vaccines take, but they were done in less than a year. That was phenomenal. I mean, if we can do that,
the mRNA platform is definitely something that us working in the industry is going to keep us busy for the next decade.
Yeah.
Someone should write a book on that. Interesting. Anything else, Chris?
No, I mean, great conversation, lots of interesting information. I'll have to read your book. Dan's going to share it with me.
I'll send it to you. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure talking with you. It's nice to have like an hour and a half to talk about stuff that matters,
Yep, and to have a talk about career and then have a reasonable discussion about with differing viewpoints. I think it's something that's you don't see on Twitter and things like that. Music, we do music here. Let me guess, based on what I read from the book, you like Joy Division?
That was one of them. You may
Yeah.
notice my hat. Can you
Elliott
see?
Smith.
Yeah, huge Elliott Smith fan.
I don't know who that is. Is that bad?
If have you seen the movie Good Will Hunting?
Yeah.
He wrote all the music pretty much to Good Will Hunting.
Seriously? Wow.
Yeah. And he was sort of known as he kind of basically invented a genre called punk folk. And it's very sort of confessional music about, he wrote a lot about depression, drug addiction and things like that. His life was not like super happy, but people who like his music, a lot of them feel like this is somebody who gets it, who knows what living with depression or what some of these things are like.
Chris, are you familiar with Elliott Smith?
Never heard of him, no.
Yeah, I saw your beanie. I
Or-
thought it was like Ezekiel Elliott at some point. I was like thinking a running
That's
back.
what I was
but-
thinking. That's exactly what I was thinking.
So any song we should listen to like later? Chris and I have a reaction channel.
Okay, yeah, definitely listen to Angela's, Angeles.
Elliott Smith, Angelus. Okay.
And the other one that I'd put up high would be Miss Misery. That was the one that he was nominated for an Academy Award for.
Oh wow. Okay. He has Angelus live, so we got something to react to later.
Yeah.
Thank you,
He
Mark.
was also really cool because in his shows, he would sometimes, fuck up. And he was very open about, like, he'd say, oh, shit. And he'd sort of laugh and the audience would like encourage him. And it was sort of a whole thing because it wasn't like a lot of the music you get now, like from American Idol, where everything is computer perfected.
Wow.
I mean, it was sort of ragged sometimes. I mean, his songs are incredibly hard to play.
We'll
guitar.
listen. And unfortunately, I just Wikipedia'd him, and he no longer with us. He died from stabbing.
Yeah, it was ruled a suicide. He stabbed himself in the heart twice.
Oh
Wow.
shit!
It was unusual.
So he
Very
definitely
unusual.
felt those emotions. I mean, that's unfortunate, but we'll definitely check it out. And thank you for bringing him to our attention. And we're always looking for new artists to react to on our channel. So thank you for that.
Okay, hope you like it.
Everybody go get the book. All right. Though the Earth Gives Way, link underneath the show notes. Chris Sauber, you'll get this one, but I want this one back. Okay. Because Mark signed it for me here. So see, I need this back, Chris. Next time I see
Fair
you,
enough.
next time I come to polluted SoCal, I'll get it back. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Everybody have a good rest of the day. And thank you very much, Mark. His Twitter handle is underneath as well. Take care.
You too, Dan.
Mark.
It's been a great pleasure.
Bye-bye.